What's that? It's okay. I think this one's fine.
Okay, guys, you're good?
Cool. All right. Well, welcome back after lunch. Hope everybody got all the food that they needed, took the bio breaks that they needed to, and ready to come back and enthusiastically start the afternoon. Yeah? Yeah. All right, we got it. So I'm Beau Woods. This is Scott Erven. We're going to do an introduction to medical device cybersecurity. It's something that we've been working on a lot lately, especially over the past couple of years with I Am the Cavalry Group to push for better outcomes sooner, or safer sooner, as we like to say. So we're going to run through a quick overview of essentially the healthcare marketplace. This is everything that would have any kind of tie into medical devices. So it's incredibly broad, incredibly diverse. If you look at the number of types of devices that you can have everything from a giant MRI machine that might cost a couple of $1 million, all the way down to literally pills that you can swallow that will report back through wireless connectivity the status of what's going on in your digestive system, and everything in between. We're coming into a really, really exciting time in medical devices and in connected wearables and implantables, where we're able to do really amazing things that we've never had the opportunity to do in our history because of some of the technology that we're putting into these devices. But as we're putting this technology in, we're also inadvertently transferring some of the risky parts of that technology, some of the vulnerabilities, some of the exposures. So as we started out a couple of years ago to look at these areas, to really try and work with all the stakeholders to get better outcomes, we found it both challenging and exciting to be able to help it safeguard our future. So, yeah, I don't know, Scott, if you have anything to add.
Not yet.
Okay, later. We'll get to Scott's part. One of the really incredible breakthroughs that we had over the last year, and we'll talk about it in a little bit more detail, is coming to go together with many of the stakeholders in this ecosystem. Very broad, very diverse. If you were here for the first session of the day, you heard from Hans Molson from Draeger, who announced to the room that he and his company are working with researchers to not just build better devices, but to build a publicly facing attestation that they accept help from researchers to do the things that only researchers of our type can do, which is some of the research that goes on currently from Scott and some others in the room. We've also found many other willing allies, and one of those is actually on the phone with us today. That is the Food and Drug Administration of the United States. You wouldn't normally think of a government agency getting engaged with just a group of passionate volunteers, but what we found is that the FDA, among many others, is willing to take help from the security research community, from us, to serve their mission better. So with that, I'll turn it over to Suzanne Schwartz and let her introduce herself and talk a little bit about her role and what they're doing. Suzanne?
Yes, Beau, thanks so much for introducing us. And again, my name is Suzanne Schwartz. I'm at the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. And here I play the part of being the Director of Emergency Preparedness Operations and Medical Countermeasures. But enough about my title. Let's just kind of jump right into it. And the first thing I'd like to really say is that this really ranks high as a milestone for FDA. Just being able to participate here in BSides Las Vegas, or for that matter, any of the conferences that take place this week, even though we're not with you all physically in the room, I have to say this is still quite a milestone and quite a treat. And so I want to really start off by telling you, Beau, and Josh Corman and Scott Erven and the entire I Am the Cavalry team, how much we at FDA really appreciate your giving us this opportunity. And who knows, maybe next year we're going to be able to come to summer camp too. So some folks might be thinking, oh, great, we have the regulator in the room with us now. Is this going to stifle open and honest discussion? And I'd be the first to admit that if I was sitting there in your shoes in the audience, I'd probably be thinking the same thing. And that means that I really have a huge task ahead of us in terms of being able to shatter some of the myths and misconceptions of who the regulator is. What do we do at FDA? How do we see ourselves and our responsibilities beyond that classical view of the regulator? It reminds me that a couple of years ago when I was attending a clinical conference and I ran into a very, very dear friend of mine, a professional colleague who I'd known for years, well before I came to the FDA. And he approached me at one point and he said, you know, Suzanne, everyone here thinks that FDA is a boogeyman. And I remember getting up to speak publicly and introducing myself saying, hi, my name is Suzanne Schwartz, and I'm here to tell you that the FDA is not the boogeyman. And so I ask you to suspend judgment, to suspend disbelief for at least a few minutes now while we paint a picture for where we want to go that might be quite different than some preconceived notions of the regulator of the FDA. We see this as the beginning of a new dialogue. It's a partnership that has truly extraordinary, even better than that, I'd call it unrealized potential for impact in the medical device cybersecurity space. And it's all towards a common goal, that goal being to protect and promote public health. If you're in the room this afternoon for this workshop, it's because you care about patient safety. Your own, every member of your family, your friends, your peers, for the greater good, and we share that mission with you. So here's my appeal. Let's get to a place of common understanding. Let's work as a team to improve the cybersecurity posture of our medical device and healthcare system. And so we have to start with some context, a little bit about the FDA. So if we could turn to the next slide, the slide that has the FDA Organizational Chart on it. FDA is an agency within the Department of Health and Human Services, and there are 4 core functions of the agency. These include medical products and tobacco, foods, global regulatory operations and policy, and the 4th one being operations. As many of you probably know, FDA, as a regulatory agency, has oversight on food, drugs, cosmetics, medical products, and tobacco. There are 3 medical product centers which are responsible for overseeing drugs, devices, and biologics before they enter the U.S. market and throughout their total product life cycle. We're going to zoom in further now and focus on specifically the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. So if we could turn to the next slide, the slide that reads the products we regulate. And this goes to the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, what we call CDRH, and that's the center where I work. CDRH regulates medical devices in the U.S. And as is characteristic of FDA's regulation of all medical products, we use a risk-based approach to classify devices, from those that are the lowest risk, which are called Class 1, to the highest or most unknown risk, which are called Class 3 devices. And it's this classification that actually drives the level of evidence that's needed in determining what's called by quote-unquote legal standards reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness whenever a new product is first being evaluated and being introduced. And you can see on this pictorial, this spectrum of devices from the simplest, Band-Aid, and yes, by the way, Band-Aids actually are medical devices, they're Class 1 medical devices, to far more advanced and complex technology, as Beau mentioned, MRI machines, CT scanners, ultrasounds, and you name it, the technology as it will continue to grow and advance is beyond amazing. When we apply this similar benefit risk-based calculus to management of medical devices once they're distributed in the field and are in use by healthcare systems. And that approach really extends to the entire device's product life cycle. Whenever a signal is brought to our attention, irrespective of whether it's cybersecurity related or not, we undergo a thorough analysis weighing the benefit against the risk to the public health at large. And those, as you can imagine, are quite tough decisions to make. And they're handled on a case-by-case basis. So let's turn to the next slide, the slide that speaks to CDRH and FDA goals. And so from the top level, at the very basic as well, it's about meeting our mission. And what is our mission? It's to, again, assure the public that the medical devices that are available for use are indeed safe and effective. And that goes regardless of what that device is and where it's supposed to be utilized. It's applied directly to cybersecurity as well. So let's get into the specifics on the cybersecurity basis. Some of our goals include raising awareness, and what we mean by that is also taking knowledge that exists in other industry sectors and being able to apply that knowledge to the healthcare, public health sector where medical devices reside. One thing that we've come to learn over time, especially as we dialogue more with other industry sectors, is that healthcare public health has quite a ways to go in terms of evolving and maturing with respect to cybersecurity awareness and cybersecurity posture. You'll notice that I bolded in purple a few key principles that are our objectives as we go forward. Firstly, it's promoting safety and security by design, by articulating what our regulatory expectations are in a clear manner. And then it's about promoting coordinated vulnerability disclosure and proactive vulnerability management. And finally, it's about minimizing reactive approaches. So there's a reason why I wanted to really highlight those three objectives, those three goals, because it's really very much within the power and the capabilities of working with the security researcher community as well as within the entire medical device stakeholder space that is going to really enable that to happen. And finally, it's about fostering this whole of community approach. So what do I mean by fostering a whole of community approach? What you'll hear a little bit later even as Beau goes on to talk, one of the themes that we continue to underscore that we think is most important is in building this type of partnering and collaboration across the entire stakeholder community and recognizing that there's so much work to be done, there's so much heavy lifting, and yet if each stakeholder group, each of us has something to give and to contribute from a skills point of view, from knowledge and expertise, that through this type of whole of community effort, we're going to be able to be in a much, much better place than we are right now. So let's move on to the next slide. And this is really just to, again, highlight what the key takeaways are if you walk away with anything from what I've said. Again, it's that emphasis on our ability to be able to foster a whole of community approach. And that means that there's a very integral role that security researchers play in this space and that we need your partnership. We're relying on being able to work together. And I think that, again, we're going to be able to do some fantastic things in terms of not only being able to bring these extraordinary advances in new technologies to our patients, but to be able to provide that level of security and safety with them. For FDA, it's also about making sure that cybersecurity risk management programs become part of the normal culture that become established within the medical device manufacturer community, as well as within the healthcare end user, healthcare delivery organization community. It's about making cyber hygiene paramount and creating a trusted space, a trusted environment for information sharing. And then the last point here is one of those busting myths, points that we like to talk about every time we have an opportunity to talk to audiences, in that in order to be able to improve the cybersecurity posture of a medical device, updates of software can be performed by the manufacturer without necessitating the manufacturer to come back to FDA with a new submission, with another pre-market application or pre-market 510K submission. It also does not necessitate, in most cases, does not necessitate a recall. So with those very, very general high-level points, I'm going to turn it back to Beau, and I look forward to having more of a dialogue with you after we finish the more formal part of this initial presentation.
Thanks, Suzanne. And I would just ask you maybe to repeat the very last thing you said, because it can't be repeated enough, if you wouldn't mind.
That software updates for cybersecurity do not require pre-market review or recall. Again, by and large, obviously there are going to be some exceptions, and those really depend upon whether the functionality of the device is impacted in such a way that it would require a pre-market review. But by and large, for improvements in cybersecurity, we've stated this verbally, we've stated it in our pre-market guidance, we've stated it in a number of different communications as well.
All right, very good. Thank you for your time, Suzanne, and if you want to hang on the line, we can do a Q&A.
Sure.
If anybody has any questions for Suzanne later, then we can open up the floor. So as I mentioned, FDA has really been a critical partner in some of the things that we've done in the past year. So as we've worked through that, Scott and I were kind of putting together a timeline of what that looked like in the past year, to go from essentially a situation a year or more ago where researchers kind of had ad hoc interactions with medical device makers, with the FDA, with MITRE, with any of the organizations that you would typically engage with when you find a vulnerability, to where we are today, which is a very, very advanced stage for the amount of time that we've had to go from 0 to 60. So this kind of started last year when, or maybe even the year before, when the FDA released draft guidance for pre-market submission. That's a medical device term for basically before you can sell a device, the FDA has to know, based on your evidence that you provide, that that device is going to be safe and effective. That kind of started the engagement. A couple of us wrote up some comments, some responses to the call for responses based on that draft guidance. Later in the year, we were engaged by a group called the Atlantic Council, which is a global policy think tank. And they wanted to study the security or lack thereof of medical devices and what the real-world implications of that were. So it was myself and a few other security researchers, as well as a lot of policymakers, and including 2 people from the FDA, one of whom was Suzanne. And we got in a room and we talked about it. And I was literally sitting across the table from the regulators in a position that felt very familiar. And I started to see that the things that the FDA was saying were really aligned to some of the things that I was saying, and that a lot of the other folks in this room have been thinking. So after that really good first engagement face-to-face, we continued to develop that relationship. We worked with them a little bit more on that pre-guidance, gave them some other information that we had. Scott actually went to an IEEE workshop held in New Orleans that was attended by a lot of policymakers, decision makers, academics, and a couple of security researchers. That was really effective because that was one of the things that was a kind of a government agency sponsored activity. Even if they didn't have a formal sponsorship role, they certainly had a lot of participation in that. Over the past year, we found that we were embraced by a lot of medical device and healthcare community conferences who would ask us to come speak on certain topics. Or when we submitted, they accepted our talk and said, this is the talk that everybody's looking forward to this year. We're really excited to have you. And just to give, to name drop a little bit, the government of Poland called Scott and said, hey, do you want to come teach us how to improve our security posture, as well as several other really key stakeholders in the market. I think it was, Josh, when was it, in March that you did this Cyber Wednesday? May, that Josh and Suzanne were on a panel talking about the product of the Atlantic Council's think tank sessions, which was a paper detailing connected medical devices and the security risks. Again, I think it was a matter of everybody was directly on the same page. Everybody was speaking the same language from the researcher side as well as from the government side. So developed and continued to develop that relationship. Suzanne was at Source Boston as one of the keynotes, talking to geeks who weren't always security researchers, but in a lot of cases developers, about the importance of developing secure code or more secure code and better decision making in developing the medical devices, secure by design, like Suzanne said. Over the past couple of months, there have been some fairly high-profile vulnerabilities announced in medical devices. Because of some of the groundwork that we had been laying as security researchers with the FDA, they reached out to us and said, we need to do something about this. We need some kind of a good coordinated way to go about working towards a safer future sooner than it would happen organically, or if it were just left up to one of the stakeholder groups to unilaterally do this. So in a day-long session of brainstorming and education, we worked with the FDA to both let them know what a vulnerability researcher does, as well as what the process looks like, some of our frustrations, particularly in the medical device manufacturer space. But also, we took a lot of education and learning from the FDA on what their role is, what their responsibilities are, how they see themselves in the chain of influence in medical devices. And some of these things eventually culminated in a safety communication that was issued, what was that, Friday, Scott?
Last Friday.
Last Friday. Yeah. So that safety communication came out and said there are vulnerabilities in these Hospira devices. Even though they're not currently for sale, we recommend that healthcare organizations really consider whether the risk is worth the benefit of these devices. And that's a really important step because it means that we got a safer outcome without demonstrable harm having come first. And it's not the first case where a medical device has had a safety communication because of software, but I think it's a trend that will continue to demonstrate harm is not a prerequisite for action. Scott, any additions?
No, but I'm just here to look good.
Well, you do a good job of that. So I just want to point out everything that's in bold here, those are key critical steps where security researchers and the FDA have partnered together to do things better, faster. So what's coming is Scott and I, as well as a number of other security researchers, healthcare organizations, government agency personnel, and people from the security community are working on a couple of things. It's essentially the spiritual successors to the automotive 5-star safety framework, which is a connected medical device procurement guide to find the choke point that is the buying process and inform the decision makers, not to supplant their judgment, but just to give them the right information to be able to take action on so they can balance the risks as well as the benefits. We're also working on something that's more of a literal successor to the 5-star, which is a Hippocratic Oath for medical devices. The idea being, physicians have a concept of modern medical ethics embodied by the Hippocratic Oath. It's a symbolic attestation to do no harm, to be only on the side of the patient for their benefit. And as the physicians take these medical oaths, they then go and instruct medical devices to carry out those treatments. And so it only makes sense to have in that chain of treatment some type of a spiritual counterpart on the behalf of the medical device itself or the medical device manufacturers to say, I understand and recognize the physician's obligation and my obligation to first patient safety and for the benefit of the patient. And I agree and I will carry that out. Finally, tomorrow night, Thursday night, we're having a small get-together for medical device security researchers, other people in the ecosystem, and just to get together and say hello, to introduce ourselves, to help build the groundwork for some of the collaboration that we need to have to be able to do what we need to do. It's called Do No Harm. So if you are interested in participating, come up and talk to us later. Hit us up on Twitter, and we'll get you the information as well as get you what you need. Beau Woods. It's pretty easy. BeauWoods.
Scott Erven.
Scott Erven. Yeah, we're easy. We don't have hacker handles. So with that, I'd like to open up the floor to questions, and we have a microphone right there. We've got about 3 or 4 minutes for questions, so time for a couple, and then we can move into the next part of the session.
How do we find you on Twitter?
You can find us on Twitter. The Cavalry handle is @IamTheCavalry. I'm @Beau Woods, and Scott is @ScottErven.
So my understanding is that the FDA hasn't updated its regs for applications since like 2009. So can you give any kind of like assessment of what their thought process is on what they're going to do, if they are going to do anything, kind of just like were they open to the process at all? Because it's a pretty bureaucratic organization. It takes a long time. Kind of just interested if it was like they felt scared and compelled, or if they felt like compelled and excited.
Yeah, so let me try and recapture your question and just make sure I got it right so that Suzanne can hear it, and maybe she can speak to that to the degree that she can. So I think your question was the FDA hasn't updated their regulations for applications, and do you mean approval applications or software applications?
Software applications.
Okay, so the FDA hasn't updated their regulations on software applications since 2009. And what's their take on that? What are they doing? And what's their posture? So Suzanne, I don't know if you want to weigh in on that.
So the first thing I would say, just in terms of being accurate in how in our nomenclature, I think what the questioner is asking is updating the guidance document, not the regulations, specifically guidance being different than regulations.
Yes, that's correct.
And is that correct?
That's correct, Suzanne.
Okay. So I can't speak to the specific plan of updating that particular guidance document. What I would tell you, though, is that we are presently engaged in putting together a cybersecurity guidance that reflects on all of the post-market expectations for managing cybersecurity of medical devices that are out there in the field. And that is basically the partnering document, the complementary document to the pre-market guidance that went final back in October 2014.
Okay. So does that kind of tell you what you needed to know? Okay. Yep. And I'll mention, if you want to have follow-up conversation or dialogue, you can get in touch with us. We can broker a conversation. The FDA has been very, very willing to engage with security researchers. Like Suzanne said, we each see ourselves as willing allies in the fight for safer sooner.
You might have just not covered this because it's kind of outside of the scope of this audience, but are you doing anything to communicate with medical device manufacturers as far as their quality systems and risk analysis goes as far as cybersecurity is concerned?
So we've done a lot of outreach to medical device manufacturers themselves. Some of that has been around their quality systems in one shape or another. When we go into those types of conversations, we don't have a particular agenda to try and influence any one thing that they're doing, but more to build that ability to collaborate, the ability to allow them to improve. We've got a lot of really, really good response from medical device makers who, you find in every one of them somebody who wants to do the right thing, who is really pushing for it. And anything that we can do to help them be more successful, they absolutely take it and they enjoy that relationship and the work that we do together. I know that some of the medical device makers have been working on their quality systems as a result of some of the interactions, as well as a result of some of the things that they've been doing on their own. So those things are improving. Obviously, I'd like to see it all fixed tomorrow so that there's never any software bugs. But bugs will always be a part of the process. If they have things that allow them to catch themselves when they fail and improve, then that's also good. And this will be the last question.
Hello. So I was kind of confused when we got that alert on Friday, though, from the FDA, because we got everybody spun up, started looking at it, and realized it appeared to be the exact same thing we got from ISCERT and NHISAC in 13 June. So was the additional delay of seeing that from FDA because they needed to vet something, or was it just a completely different track where they were getting it directly from the vendor? What was the gap there?
Yeah, that would probably be a good one for Suzanne to weigh in on. So Suzanne, to just repeat the question for you, he asked, the safety communication that was put out was similar to ones that had been put out on June 13th by ICS-CERT and some others. So how did the FDA's safety communication differ from those earlier ones?
How did the FDA safety communication that we put out on Friday, this past Friday, on the SIMBIG differ from our previous ones or from the ICS-CERT one? I didn't hear the question totality.
From the ICS-CERT ones.
Specifically from the ICS-CERT.
Well, to start with, obviously, the two agencies, ICS-CERT and FDA, have different functions and different responsibilities. And while the ICS-CERT advisory provided not only awareness and specific details with regard to the vulnerability and its identification, but also worked with the manufacturer regarding the mitigation measures that should be put into place. Where the FDA safety communication is different is that it gets really much more into what we consider from the, again, patient safety, public health perspective when we weigh that out, and made a recommendation that was worded as strongly encouraged discontinuing use of the pump for the reasons that were identified, which was not stated in the ICS Cert Advisory. And of course, wouldn't have been appropriate for the ICS Cert Advisory, being that they are not the regulator of the medical device industry. But I will tell you that we work very closely together, ICS Cert and FDA, on the advisories or communications so that we have visibility on the issues that arise and that we understand exactly what the vulnerabilities are that are being brought to ICS Cert's attention. And this level of dialogue and interaction has been very, very beneficial across government. I think that it adds to a great degree of agility, to be very honest with you, in terms of being able to move a lot faster just by virtue of being that much more communicative. And so that's the primary, that would have to be the primary difference between the earlier communications that were put out by the ICS Cert Advisory and our safety communication, which is clearly geared towards addressing the healthcare and public health user community.
Okay. Thank you, Suzanne. So with that, we're going to transition from the discussion that we've had, the kind of facilitated discussion, to some of the workshops that we had talked about to start building some small initiatives, as well as leadership and recruiting willing allies, willing partners to do things to, again, promote safer sooner. So we want to go through and spend maybe the next 10 minutes coming up with some small projects that we could potentially do as security researchers or as others, bringing others into the play, to help do better, to be more effective. And as if you were in the panel discussion, this is the idea of a do-ocracy, right? So whoever it is that wants to change things, to stand up and take charge, to lead, giving ourselves the permission as well as the support to do that. So for the next 10 minutes,